For those who wonder if I still read the Bible anymore, I'll show you what I'm working with. A very short passage from Matthew's stories about Jesus of Nazareth. A story we find in Matthew 18, a story that comes amid parables about what it means to forgive. These are words that are spoken, and then a story is told about one who forgives someone a great debt, and the one who is forgiven turns around and refuses to forgive someone else of a very small debt. Before that story, we hear these words. Peter came to Jesus and he said to him, "Teacher, if someone sins against me, how often should I forgive? Should I forgive as many as 7 times?" And Jesus answered him, "No, not 7 times, but I tell you, 70 times 7. In this ancient wisdom, it is the hardest word. It's not a difficult word to pronounce. It's a really easy word to say, and a terribly difficult word to actualize. It's rarely an easy thing to forgive, and sometimes it's utterly unimaginable. I used to hear that exchange between Jesus and Peter as a conversation about how to deal with repeat offenders, how to deal with someone who harms you over and over again. How many times should you forgive someone who has hurt you repeatedly? And I would hear this urging to unlimited forgiveness really as a form of stupidity. Somewhere along the way in that mathematical calculation of forgiveness, we pass through the zone of being incredibly spiritually mature to being utterly ridiculous, to being a highly decorated doormat for feet to be wiped on 490 times, 70 times 7. And then I began to wonder if maybe the recidivism that requires this repeated forgiveness isn't on the part of the one who's caused the pain, that it isn't at all about the one who chronically harms us, who's seeking forgiveness from us again and again. But maybe it's about the one extending forgiveness, who's unable to forgive once and for all, and is being taught to keep at it, to ignore the scoreboard, to retire the ledger, and to just keep at the process of forgiving over and over again. Because maybe it isn't our repeated offenses that need unlimited forgiveness, as much as it's our tendency to resurrect that same old hurt again and again, to unbury our grudge or our guilt, and re-immerse ourselves in the wounds of our victimhood over and over again. You know how it goes. We think we have forgiven ourselves, or we think we have forgiven someone else. We think we have let go of the hurt or the harm, that we've let go of the flaw or the fault or the failure, whatever it is that has injured us. And then something scratches the skin off that scar and it becomes an open wound again, and we have to start all over again with our 7 times 70. Because to be effective, forgiveness has to be habit forming. We don't just boot it up once and for all and that's it. Forgiveness is ultimately a continuous practice, a way of life. It's what an open heart does. It's a habit that the soul needs in order to be free. Survivors of Indian residential schools have taught us that forgiveness isn't an action that is completed in any given moment. It's a process that takes the time it takes. In the stories of these mentors, we hear the same 4 words spoken over and over again. If you listened to the witness of those at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission tell their stories, we heard the same 4 words again and again. We heard the stories of confusion and terror in being forcibly removed from families as very young children. We heard about the humiliation of being stripped of their traditional clothing and having their braids cut off. We heard the punishments that were inflicted when they spoke their own language or when they spoke to a family member. We heard about their loneliness, their homesickness for their parents and for their communities and for their way of life. And in some cases, we heard about unspeakable acts of physical or sexual abuse. And over again, as we have heard those speak of these most painful experiences, we have heard survivor after survivor say the same 4 words: I learned to forgive. I learned to forgive. Among all the voices of wisdom we heard speak today, in some of the voices we heard in the Forgiveness Project, we meet mentors who have something to teach us about learning to forgive. The nature of life is such that we wound each other, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. The nature of being human is that we think great thoughts and terrible thoughts. We do wonderful things and horrible things. We achieve and we fail. We hurt and we heal. We are victims and we are victimizers. We can be loving and we can be hateful. We can be trusting and we can be fearful. We can destroy the world and we can save the world. Our hearts can break open and they can lock shut. Each and every time we forgive ourselves or we forgive someone else, we change our heart. We don't change our mind, we change our heart. And every change of heart changes the world. That's how forgiveness works. We don't have to change someone else. We change ourselves, our relationship to what has harmed us. We forgive, not in order to set someone else free. We forgive in order to free ourselves from the dead end of bitterness. We forgive in order to be free. We don't forgive in order to reconcile, although that's a great and wonderful thing when it happens. but it requires more than one party. That's your work and my work together. Whereas forgiveness, that's my work. And that's your work. It's all about us. It's only about us. It doesn't need anyone else to come to the table. It doesn't require an apology. It has no prerequisites or conditions to be satisfied. It doesn't need to be heard or seen or publicized. Because forgiveness is always and only in the power of one, this one, that one. It's within you and within me to forgive. And it's a gift we give ourselves. And it's one of the greatest spiritual tools we have at our disposal. Our capacity to forgive and to keep on forgiving. To keep letting go of anything and everything that would hold us hostage. That would hold us hostage to our identity as a victim. Or our identity as a survivor. To any wound that threatens to keep us in some category of blame or shame where someone else is responsible for our brokenness or our hurt. We've gained some insights as we've lived into some of our most primal wounds. And we have learned from the stories of one another, and we have learned from the experiences of others some of our historic wrongs that we have inflicted on one another or that we've been complicit in. But to compound these wounds and these wrongs by locking ourselves into an identity that we are adult children of something or other, that we are survivors of something or other, that we are victims of something or other, is to have starved our soul on blame and resentment when we could be feeding it on forgiveness and freedom. Our freedom as those who have been hurt doesn't depend on the scales of justice being balanced. It doesn't depend on wrongs being righted. Justice making is a distinct and separate piece of work, but it is utterly dependent on the work of forgiveness. Our freedom depends on our capacity to forgive just like we breathe, again and again, consciously and unconsciously. As for the hurts we've caused, forgiving ourselves is a first step on the road to healing. The soul needs healthy habits. We only form habits by practices that we repeat over and over again, some of which we're never finished with, some of which are never finished with us, but we're committed to continue. 7 times 70 is the very peculiar math of a spiritual teacher who tells us that does not equal 490. It's one of the ways of calculating the infinite, the habitual, the life practice, that which we do again and again, just like we breathe. Today's a day to ponder, where we each need to cultivate the habit of forgiving.